The TVR is certainly one of my favorite restoration projects, which is by now completed. There were not that many built, about 654 were built from 1971 to 1979 if I'm not mistaken. It's powered by a Ford SX V6 and it's a 3000cc. It develops quite a bit of horsepower, but of course in today's norms it is not powerful. But it had a lot of issues like sagging doors, a very well known issue with TVRs. Also the top of the frame of the windows wasn't good and the bumpers were totally ripped. The cushions were gone. The dashboard looked a bit tacky, the radio was removed, and the middle console had this ugly aluminum plate. A lot of things I didn't like. Some of the handles were missing, so it was time to park it into the garage and check the engine out. There was a lot of non-original parts on that engine, and it had quite some issues with oil leaks all over the place, and somebody cut off the inner fenders to have a better cooling, or at least that's what they told me. And here you can actually see the oil which is leaking from the valve cover. We have an electronic ignition, but the good thing was that the oil pressure was pretty good, especially the higher RPMs. You could even see the car smoke whenever we had it running, just because of all the oil that was spilled all over the engine. But underneath the car, it wasn't any better. There was leaks of oil all over the place, mainly from the drain plug. The suspension, well, it had had better days, and on one side the spring was loose, on the other side it was not. Corrosion, well, that's another problem you have with these TVRs, but the frame here was not too bad. It was a little surface rust, but not really anything seriously. But the oil leak, yeah, that was all over the place, and that little separation plate was loose. The exhaust was in a poor condition. In fact, the headers were really bad as well. You can see the poor welding jobs. Although the pots, they looked reasonably alright. The brakes, well, they looked pretty much intact, so I did a cleanup on those, and they already had installed these flex cables of braided stainless steel. The radiator, well, that was leaking. The expansion tank or the swirl pot, that wasn't all that good. The water pump was something to be replaced, and the snare, so a lot of stuff was really wrong. In fact, the expansion tank itself, the pipe that comes out for the overpressure to catch the additional water, was loose. And as you can see, the radiator had lots of issues. So I decided to start off with fixing that expansion tank so I could at least do a pressure test to see where else this engine was actually leaking, because cooling is so important, and you could see it. It's dripping all over the place. Even the radiator on the bottom was dripping. So this car was really in a bad state. So I had to remove the radiator, and now had a new one being built for me with a high efficiency core, which we'll install later. Now, the exhaust, well, there wasn't much I could do with the original headers. They were really gone and very thin. So I was actually forced to remove those. So I got new mild steel headers. I could have gone for stainless steel, but they're a bit too expensive. So I decided to wrap them first of all, so I can protect the engine cabin and the engine bay from heat. And then it was time to clean up the rest a bit on the cooling system to see what was going on with it. And you could see the swirl pot, I blasted it, and it didn't turn out to be that good. The expansion tank was okay. And while I had the chance, I blasted underneath the chassis to get it all cleaned up. And here you have a bit of a better look on how clean it already was after I had it repainted and rerun the cables. After about 4 weeks, I got my new radiator back, and this is a high efficiency radiator. I installed a new oil water pump. This is the old one, and of course a new thermostat. The swell pot, well, as you could see, that's the old one, had really an issue, and the expansion tank, well, that turned out to be pretty nice after it had been painted. So we knew we're about ready to get things reinstalled. Here is a bit of a close-up on what we have done with the wheels and the brake system and the springs and the suspension and the uprights. We cleaned it all up, we checked it all out, and we replaced what was necessary to be replaced. But overall, this wasn't too bad. The bushes were here and there replaced, but the shock was good. The ball joints were also replaced. While you're at it, you might as well do it. And then I'll toss away these half fenders inside. The downlink, well, that one I didn't have a replacement for at the time, but I ordered some new ones. And here you have a look on the distribution at the very well-known nylon tooth wheels that go bad sometimes. So I just wanted to check on that because there was a kind of an oil leak. So I replaced the seal. Then it was time to take out the muffler system. You see the water dripping out of it. So I had to disassemble that all into different pieces, warm it up, and force it out. And then finally, I decided to give it the last minute blast with some Garnet 360. And then I noticed that they were actually stainless steel pots. So they turned out to be quite all right. So now it was time to remove the old header. And that thing was really in a bad state. And I was about ready to install the new one. But before I did, I cleaned up all the bolt holes. And sometimes you get corrosion in it, and fitting a new header is a little bit of work, and it's hard to get to it. So you want to make sure that the bolts are going in very smoothly, and at the end you torque it down. So now it's time to reshape a little bit the exhaust and recover what I could. So I had to hammer a couple of pieces, and then I do a little bit of trial fitting. In fact, some of the pipes I had to stretch a bit with a stretching tool to make sure they actually would go onto the cart. And here I'm actually installing it, the last two pots on the middle pot. And again, it's a little bit of fiddling, but at the end, I think the result turned out to be quite all right. Somebody in the Netherlands actually had molded for me brand new inner fenders, and you can still see some of the residue of the molding on it. So we will install those. But before doing so, I wanted to make sure that the engine was in a good shape. So I did a compression test on it, and that turned out to be all right. I also decided to do a blow-by test, but getting the valve covers off was really a nightmare. You can see all the blue stuff, the silicone that they had on it. I mean, they really glued this car together. So here I'm actually doing a blow-by test, which is checking if we have no leaks through the valves or through the sides of the piston. And that turned out to be okay. But again, that silicone stuff was a nightmare. So I decided to change the valve covers with some alloy valve covers, and they look pretty neat. But before doing so, I wanted to change the valve seals because they tend to go over time and then you get some oil consumption. So I did this with the cylinder head in place, and by just placing some compressed air into the cylinder and then removing the tumblers and then knocking on top of the valve dishes to loosen up these little clips. And then with the special pliers, I pushed down the spring, and then I was able to get these clips out with a magnet. I always like to do it with a magnet because if they fall into your engine, then you have a big problem. And now I could remove the old valve seals and be ready to install the new one. And that will actually prevent burning oil. You just press down the springs again, and then you put the clip into place, and basically you're kind of done with it. Takes a little bit of time to do it, but it's not too bad. And at the end, of course, you have to readjust the valve clearance. Now, I did check all the valves on their compression rates. So I put a certain amount of pressure up, and then I see how much they depress. Now, the push rods, they should be straight. And guess what? I got about 2 of them, which were really not straight at all. So that's something I had to replace as well. Meanwhile, the valve covers were painted and cleaned up and about ready to go onto the engine. But of course, I still had to clean that whole head up. And I took the degas carburetor off, and I have some other videos where I actually reconditioned the Weber degas carburetor. And now it was time to fix that one plate, since meanwhile I got so many parts coming in. I jumped back and forth a bit with the repair. So here I'm straightening up the oil pan because I couldn't get the nut sealing up that hole because it was bent. So this is the new aluminum plate that I'm going to fit between the gearbox and the engine. That's where this other flaky stuff was, so now that looks a lot better. I removed the anti-roll bar for reconditioning. That was a little bit of fiddling, but the downlinks were of different size, so I actually had to turn some bushes on the lathe, and then I placed those bushes over the bolt, and then everything was just fine. The anti-roll bar itself was in a good condition. I just repainted it and had some new bushes for it. So now I'm about to putting it back into place. I could have replaced it, but it wasn't in a too good state to replace it. Again, this is a little bit of fiddling the way this is mounted. And now it was time for the new swirl pot, as you could see. But before I would install all that, I wanted to make sure that the fans were working. So I double checked both fans that they were running in the right direction because the cabling was a bit screwed up. The new radiator was installed and locked into place. And now I installed actually the swirl pot. And this is a aluminum based swirl pot because the old one was not recoverable at all. So there was a lot of work on the cooling system on this car because I actually replaced all the hoses with new blue hoses, and you probably noticed as well that I had a new fuel pump up. Here I'm putting up some more silicone hoses, and I had to make a special adjustment, a cap on the swirl pot. Because I wanted to have my sensing probe inside that and not sticking through the tubing. So I welded up some copper tubes and then I got the cap with a hole in it, put it all together with a seal. So now I could place it on top of the swirl pot and then inside I could actually drop the sensor. So now my Canlo um, adjustment for the temperature for the fans works properly. So with all that in place, I could now fill up the car with fresh cooling liquid. And I did this under vacuum. It always works fine. And then it was kind of time to crank up the engine for the very first time after all the adjustments, and it just ran very smoothly. Smoothly, it was like music to my ears. The doors, well, that was a pain in the butt to work on. I mean, to get those off, I've been swearing and moaning on these doors, but at the end, I just got them off, and then to get the hinges off, that was another problem from the frame, but they came out. So here you see the new hinge and the old hinge, and I will rebuild the old hinge just to show you that you don't need to buy new ones, but I did buy new ones, so now I have a spare set. Actually, what you see here is I'm actually rebuilding that old hinge by making some bushes, drilling out the hole so I can put that bush inside. The bush here is also out of aluminum, just like the hinge. So now I will just have to press that in, and then the pin is going through. And here I'm pushing the bush into the old hinge. And now the pin is going through, and in fact now we have a completely repaired hinge, which is as good as a new one. So with a little bit of effort, you can do this. I got the two new hinges on the car, and now I had to put it all back together, and that went not too bad. Meanwhile, I got Chinese door handles, and that was cheap stuff, but it looks good. Unfortunately, I had to repaint the door, and here I have the door already in its base coat, but I saw still some unevenness, so we sanded it out, and then we rinsed it all down, and then it was time for the final coat of yellow. So we sprayed it a couple of layers on that, and at the end we inspected it for imperfections, and it could go back on the car. I'm also painting here the sill. Um, yeah, this was something else. The bumpers, they really got in a bad state. I don't know how that can be that bad like this, but the rubber was ripped and the metal bar inside was really, really bad. So I got a new set of stainless steel bumpers, and you would think this is going to be an easy fit. Well, then you have it wrong. That wasn't the case. So I had to make special adaptations to that. So I got stainless steel washers and bolts. So here I'm actually making up these special attachments to correct the hole or the positioning of the fixing area onto that new bumper. And I wanted to be careful and not to destroy anything. So now with that bolt repositioned to align with the hole, I now could fit these bumpers. And I have to say, they look pretty good. But my God, it's a bit of work. The backside was done as well, and that went quite easy. So by now, The TVR was ready. I did a couple of other things like putting in new seats from a Miata, um, and a couple of other small things that I had to do. But overall, this engine is now running very smoothly and very nice to drive with. So I really enjoyed this TVR when it was all finished. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. It gives you a little bit of a story on how the TVR was done and repaired. You can see all the videos in great detail on my YouTube channel. Thank you for viewing and bye bye.